Welcome everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Welcome to this very special event co-hosted between the New York Times and the International Cyber Policy Centre at ASPI. I'm Fergus Hansen, the head of that centre. The centre now has one of the largest concentrations of cyber researchers in the Western world working in a think tank. And with so much going on in this domain, it couldn't be a better time to have today's speaker. Just these last 2 weeks, we've had the Australian Prime Minister come out and announce that the Parliament and 3 major political parties have been hacked by a nation state. We've had China link its go-slow approach to Australian coal exports to our decision to ban Chinese tech firms from the 5G build. And we're about to head into an election where Australia may very well come to experience what so many other democracies have had to grapple with: foreign interference during the heat of an election campaign. David Sanger, our guest, is one of the world's great journalists, and even more so if you're working in the international relations and cyber fields. I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with David's writing in both the New York Times and his thriller-style foreign policy books. David is a national security correspondent and a senior writer with a 36-year reporting career with the Times. David, you've been on 3 teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes, most recently in 2017 for international reporting. You're also a best-selling writer. And for all the people in this room following cyber issues, your last 2 touched on these issues in some really granular and amazing detail. Your latest one being The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage and Fear in the Cyber Age. It's been recommended to me constantly by my friends, and I can highly recommend it to everyone in the room that hasn't already read it. During your career at the Times, you've served as Tokyo Bureau Chief, Washington Economic Correspondent, White House Correspondent during the Clinton and Bush administrations, and Chief Washington Correspondent. Your reporting on the cyber-enabled thefts, or cyber-enabled efforts to stop Iran's nuclear program even led to an Academy Award shortlisted documentary, 0 Days. A graduate of Harvard College, you're the first senior fellow in the Press and National Security at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, and co-teach Central Challenges in American National Security, Strategy and the Press at the Kennedy School of Government. David, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here and host you here today. Please join me in welcoming him. Thank you. Now, the format for today, we're going to do a quick in-conversation between Dave and myself, and then open it up to questions. This conversation is on the record. It's being live streamed. So if you could think of your questions and make sure you let us know who you are, so David has that context. David, I thought I'd start with something that it seems we have in common. It looks like we've both made the pilgrimage to Henry Kissinger's house in upstate Connecticut in the wilds. During my visit, I was confronted with a family of black bears. It sounds like yours was a lot more productive. Yeah. And you'd ask Kissinger when you were there, what's the difference between this new age and the experience that he had during the Cold War? And his response was, it's far more complex, and over the long term, it may be far more dangerous. Do you agree that is cyber really pushing us into a domain where the world is becoming more dangerous and complex than during the Cold War, when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, 2 superpowers poised to have a nuclear exchange?
Well, first, thanks very much for having me. Thanks to all of you for coming out today. It's great to see so many people interested in the topic. Thanks to ASPI for doing this, and my colleagues in the Times' growing Sydney bureau here, as the paper is dedicated to covering all things in Australia, and certainly in the national security realm, to spend a fair bit of time, because Australia is such a big and critical player in all of the national security territory, but particularly in cyber, where Australia's always sort of hid its candle a little bit, but been much more of a significant both defensive and offensive player than probably the government would, freely discuss. So your question is just right, and I'm glad that you came out on the right side of the black bears. When Australians come to America, we just want to sort of make them feel at home, so we bring out sort of our vicious wildlife just to see what we can do. So when I asked Dr. Kissinger that question, his longer answer was that in the Cold War, of course, we had one primary adversary in the Soviet Union, and that while the results could be incredibly terrifying through the Cuban Missile Crisis, as you suggested, and nuclear standoff in general, and the worst case scenario in many ways far worse than something that we could imagine in cyber. The fact of the matter was, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the weapons themselves weren't employed. It was the fear of the weapons that were employed. In cyber, it's completely different. Cyber weapons are not like nuclear weapons. First of all, in a nuclear weapon, you know pretty much where it's coming from, and there's sort of no way to adjust it up and down. You can maybe change the yield somewhat, but by and large, if you set off a nuclear weapon, you know what the response is likely to be. Cyber is the complete opposite. You're unlikely to know where it comes from for some time, as you see in the continuing debate about who exactly did those attacks on the Australian party systems in the parliament. But that's just one of many cases of difficult attribution. Second, the weapon can be adjusted. The attacks on the parties were not something that you would conduct a military operation in response to, even if you could figure out who it was. And that's been the case with most of the cyber conflict that we've seen so far. It's been calibrated to be just below the level of active warfare. It's a short of war weapon. And that's why we're using it every day, or someone's using it every day, or every hour. And that's what makes it so much more complex. Because unlike nuclear weapons, which we don't employ, we threaten their eventual use if things got out of control. In the case of cyber, we're using it in new and different ways. We're using it for espionage. We're using it for data manipulation. By we here, I mean both the West and its adversaries. And you could imagine, if you went into the Australian military's database and changed the blood types of every soldier and sailor, you could imagine the incredible but subtle damage that could be done with that, or into financial systems, or into autonomous vehicles, or into the targeting of your weapons, or into the navigation of your ships. Then we've also seen it being used to affect actual physical equipment without bombing or sending in saboteurs. And that's what Olympic Games, the code name for the American and Israeli attack on the Iranian centrifuges, was all about. It was about having an effect that we thought the Iranians wouldn't respond to militarily. But had the Israelis done the simple thing, which was just bomb Natanz, it probably would have started another war in the Middle East. And then finally, we have this collection of influence operation events where, again, they've all been taking place at a short of war level. And that's why Kissinger, I think, was so worried about the danger part of that sentence, because we don't know how you get off the escalation ladder here.
Well, let me ask you a chaser to that. So we've got the world becoming more complex, more dangerous. But in your book, you describe cyber weapons as the perfect weapon. So why is something that makes the world more dangerous and more complex the perfect weapon?
It's the perfect weapon for the offensive side. It's cheap, it's deniable, it's hard to trace, and most importantly, it can be, but because you can calibrate it the way we have described, you can use it for a huge variety of purposes that enable you to level the playing field. I mean, in what other way would North Korea be able to directly take on the United States? Let me give you an example from one of the most telling and now most studied cyber attacks, which was the North Korean attack on Sony. Okay, you'll remember that that attack was prompted because Sony was producing a truly terrible movie called The Interview. How many of you have seen it? Come on, admit it. Okay. For the rest of you who have not, I can save you 2 hours of your life right now. It was a movie basically.
Kim Jong-il's work.
Yes, right. Well, I'm going up to Vietnam tomorrow to cover the summit, so we'll see the subject of the movie. But the concept was that they were going to hire, that the CIA recruited 2 journalists who were supposed to go interview Kim Jong-un to actually assassinate him. Now, I've been around journalists for 30 some odd years, and I can tell you, if you were to take one cohort profession to hire for hitmen, I can't think of a group that would be most likely to screw up the job. But it was a comedy. The North Koreans didn't take the joke. They immediately did what you would do if you wanted to stop a movie from coming out in Hollywood. They wrote a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations, because we know just how influential he is with producers in Hollywood. And when that had the predictable result, they then dispatched their hackers to China, Malaysia, Thailand, and began this very complex, very patient attack on a completely undefended Sony system. They looked at how their computer systems connected to the accounting systems at Sony, to the movie-making systems, to the emails. They released some emails in sort of an early indication of what the Russians would later do. They weren't quite as newsworthy. We mostly learned that Angelina Jolie is incredibly difficult to work with on the set. Wasn't much of a story for the Times, but it was a really great story for the National Enquirer. And it would have done well with the Murdoch papers here. So when this attack happened, it was notable because the North Koreans had tried to attack Sony in a pre-cyber age, they would have had to send in some commandos and basically get on the studio tour and blow up the computer system. Instead, doing the attack they did, Fergus, they destroyed 70% of Sony's ability to operate their computers and networks in about 2.5 minutes. They completely melted down the hard drives in most of the Sony computers. And they paid almost no price for it. President Obama, at the end of great debate, put a few economic sanctions on the North Koreans that I bet they never felt amid all the other economic sanctions that are on the North Koreans, right? So it's a classic example of what makes this the perfect weapon. What else could a broke country with no ability to reach the United States with strategic weapons, what other method could they use to get deep inside our systems and say, want to sanction us? Want to see 2 people play this game? So for that, cyber was the perfect weapon.
I want to ask you one more sort of framing question before I drill down into a couple of specifics. But in your book, you grapple with whether the current, one of the issues you grapple with is whether the current level of secrecy surrounding the use of cyber weapons is healthy or productive. And seeing as though you routinely break stories that blow a hole in that secrecy, I'm guessing that you have a sort of vested interest in that.
Yeah. No, I confess that, yeah.
I'm just wondering, what is the case for being secretive about this? Presumably a government department would argue that, if you have big releases of the methods and the tools that are being used, you can have situations like WannaCry and NotPetya where they're repurposed to do, global damage. You could have proliferation of the weapons to more and more countries. Cyber criminals could start using use it and ready-to-use kit to sort of just roll it out there. I mean, what's the rationale for transparency? We're
having that already. I mean, WannaCry was based on stolen American weapons that were stolen from inside the National Security Agency, from inside what's called the Tailored Access Operations Group of the NSA, which is the sort of special forces that breaks into foreign computer systems. And when they were stolen and published by a group called shadow brokers that we still don't really understand fully, the North Koreans seized some of that code, used it to make WannaCry, attacked in a wide variety of targets. The one they ended up hitting wasn't one they were aiming at, which was the British healthcare system, which, as you remember, was pretty well crippled. And the only part about this that the US government didn't own up to was the fact that our own weapons were being used to help the North Koreans create this. Now, why was that? Well, first of all, cyber is a weapon that is largely created. It is a creation of the intelligence agencies. And what do you know? The intelligence agencies are naturally secretive. Okay, so big surprise there that they wouldn't want to let it out. Second, they assume that the more you hide about our capabilities, the better off you are. I think we've actually gone past the pendulum swing on this, and that if you revealed capabilities, if the US had admitted, and Israel had admitted to Olympic Games, and said, yeah, we did that to the centrifuges, and you should see what else we are able to go do, you actually build some more deterrence into the system. And that we're actually stepping on our own deterrence and stepping on our own ability to call out other countries by wrapping all of this in such secrecy and convincing ourselves that if we made public, for example, who attacked the Australian Parliament and the political parties, that somehow or another that's going to reveal our sources and methods. I think this is a ridiculous argument because we have private companies, CrowdStrike, FireEye, many others, that are turning out reports all the time, and your group, I'm sure, over time will begin at least analyzing some of those to say, here was the culprit. In fact, how did we learn about the Russia attacks on the DNC? Because CrowdStrike published their results. Now, we are seeing a little bit of a change in that. I mean, we saw the Australian government say last week that a major nation-state actor was responsible for these attacks. They didn't say who, but it seems like we're already down to about 2 suspects, China and maybe Iran. And I actually don't think at this point that we're gaining very much from the secrecy around either our capabilities or our ability to go indicate who's attacking us. And if you think about it in the nuclear world, we kept secret how you make nuclear weapons, where you store them, who's got authority to launch them. But we had a big open debate about how we wanted to use them. And that debate ended up in a completely different place than it began. I mean, we began with MacArthur wanting to drop the bomb on North Korea and China. We learned more recently that General Westmoreland wanted to have the bomb in Vietnam in case we were losing it case on. We had cases in the Cuban Missile Crisis where we had generals advocating just bombing the Soviet Union and ending this whole thing now. And we ended up saying, no, we're only going to use this weapon as a matter of national survival. We have never had that equivalent national discussion or international discussion around cyber.
Let me pick you up on one of the specifics that you mentioned there about the election, the interference that we've had here with the Australian Parliament and 3 political parties. You came out quite strongly criticising the Obama administration for not coming out sooner, for calling out Putin for what happened in the 2016 presidential election, and also for not imposing costs on him at an early stage or on Russia. I'm wondering what lessons can Australia learn from what went wrong in the United States, and what advice could you give an Australian government in terms of how to handle the situation that they find themselves in now?
Well, I'm not sure the Australian government is seeking advice from New York Times reporters, but let me tell you at least what I learned in doing the reporting on the Russia hack in the US. Before you heard about the attack on the DNC, there were a lot of other attacks that were based in Russia, from Russia on the US. There was a famous one in 2008 when USB drives were spread out on a parking lot in the Middle East, got picked up by US personnel, put into classified systems, and suddenly there was a beaconing out of the cybernet, which is the classified communication system out there. If you're wondering why when you go into US installations now, the USBs are all super glued over, that's how come. Low-tech solution, but it works. The Russians attacked the White House unclassified email system, the State Department's unclassified communication systems, the Joint Chiefs of Staff unclassified and classified systems. And the response was that the US not only didn't call out Russia for doing it, but didn't impose any costs. So you're Vladimir Putin and you're thinking, okay, they're not going to defend the White House system. Who's going to care about the Democratic National Committee, which is essentially staffed by college kids, right? I mean, it's perpetually broke. There's a scene in the book where the DNC brings in a very respected cyber expert prior to the 2016 election. He gives them a list, you know, as long as your arm, of the vulnerabilities of the system, and they said, well, this would be very expensive to fix. We'll do it after the election. Bad call. So what are the lessons for Australia out of this? If they come to the determination that this attack was from China or from Iran or, you know, whoever launched it, I think it's in their strong interest to publish that data, publish the indicators, get as close as they can to indicating who it is who launched it, if they've got that data, because they want to show the Chinese Ministry of State Security that this is not a free ball and that there will be consequences. Now, in the US, we've taken the next step. We've actually indicted now, over the past 4 years, people from China, officers of the PLA, and just recently arrested a Ministry of State Security official who showed up in Belgium in a sting and ended up getting extradited to the US. We've indicted Iranians, we've indicted North Koreans, we've indicted Russians. In fact, the Mueller indictment of the Russians was extremely detailed from the Internet Research Agency and also from the GRU, the military intelligence side. Now, there are some countries and some people like Vladimir Putin who are unembarrassable. So you can name them and it doesn't mean they're going to stop. But there are others who are highly embarrassable because they're going to be afraid that it's going to be hard to get investment in their own country if they're known as a serial violator in this case.
Well, what about this idea? I mean, in Australia, we've never gone down this pathway of making attributions by ourselves when it comes to a cyber attack. We've
done it with the other Five Eyes.
Yeah, we've done it as coalitions. There's been a safety in numbers approach. You're suggesting that, you know, Australia is weighty enough in the international system that it can come out and make an attribution about who was behind the attack on Parliament. My question to you is, do you agree with that, you know, Australia can actually do that by itself, but do you also, we haven't seen, even as part of these attributions that have happened so far, with the exception of the United States, there's been no visible costs imposed. So countries have been too timid to say, we know Russia, you committed NotPetya, and here's some sanctions to say thank you for the billions of dollars of damage you caused. No one's crossed that pathway yet. Do you think that it's time that we cross over into that costs zone and that doesn't necessarily lead to escalation?
I don't see the argument against it. I mean, you're already the one country that has banned Huawei outright. Nothing you're going to do beyond that is going to anger the Chinese more than banning their national champion. So I'm not quite sure what the downside is. You know, you're not high on their Christmas card list at this point, you know, in any case. So the second point is, Australia is really good at this. I mean, its signals intelligence operation is known as one of the best in the world. So would it be nice if you bring in GCHQ or the NSA or somebody else to do an independent look and come announce their conclusions? Sure, there's safety in numbers. We've seen that happen in non-cyber examples. When the North Koreans sank a South Korean ship that killed 46 South Koreans, they wanted to show that it wasn't just their own operation. They put together an international investigative group, I think perhaps headed by somebody from Norway, but I may have that wrong. But in any case, they had this international group announce what it was their conclusions were. That wouldn't be a bad idea in the cyber arena, but I don't think in a case when your own parliament has been attacked and your own parties, that you need to wait for that if you've got good evidence. But you're going to have to be willing to show your work. And that's the part where people in the intelligence agencies are going to say, well, wait a minute, then the Chinese are going to discover that we're watching them. And my answer to that is, if the Chinese haven't figured that out by now, they wouldn't be able to attack you in the first place.
Well, let me just also pick a little bit apart that idea about the indictments that you mentioned. I mean, CrowdStrike's come out, I think, this week or last week saying that they didn't have any effect. What's the point of issuing these indictments if you're never actually going to be able to arrest these individuals? Is that really a metric that we should be using, and what do you think they do achieve or are intended to achieve?
Well, they're intended to use an American baseball analogy, and I fear to do this in an Australian context, but it's basically a brushback pitch, which is to say when the ball is thrown at somebody's head to make them step out of the batter's box for a moment or two and just intimidate them. So the Mueller indictment of the GRU and the Internet Research Agency was astounding because you saw how many text messages they picked up among the people who were conducting these attacks and so forth. And the message of the indictment, even if those people never step into an American courtroom, was, we know where you live and we can come after you. And in what happened in the 2018 midterm elections, the NSA's operation and Cyber Command's operation against the Russians was mostly consisting of text messages to individual hackers working for the Russian government saying, we know what you're working on, and we also know your telephone number, and we know a lot more about you. Now imagine this in sort of a Cold War context. If you were doing this, if we had had cell phones and instant messaging to somebody who's sitting in a missile silo somewhere in Russia maintaining a missile that was going to be aimed at the United States, it becomes a lot more personal when you begin to say, we understand this isn't just a machine out there. There are people behind it, and we're going to find you.
David, I mean, a lot of the visible cyber attacks we've seen have tended to be, we've seen Russia in the United States with NotPetya, we've seen North Korea with WannaCry, we've seen Iran and the banking system and various attacks in there. China seems to fly a little bit more under the radar than some of those sort of more blatant approaches. I was wondering what your sort of view is in terms of, I think there's two dimensions of this. One is its use of cyber domestically, the Communist Party's use of these technologies against its own people, and then internationally in terms of what it's trying to achieve. Could you sort of paint a picture
Sure.
about where you see things heading, both in the domestic context of China and internationally about how it's shaping up to use these tools over the next sort of 5-10 years?
So no surprise, every country uses cyber to go pursue their own national interests. So the Russians use it for disruption because they don't have the kind of growth and future that the Chinese do. But their whole strategy, whether it is hybrid warfare in Ukraine or sending submarines off the coast in the Black Sea, is one of disruption and the potential to cause more damage. The North Koreans use cyber to steal cash because they need cash. That's the Bank of Bangladesh part. And to show companies they could get inside them. So the message to everybody is, you want to do sanctions on us? Okay, we have our own methodology. Very similar thing for the Iranians, right? The Chinese have a different game here. They don't need to be disruptive, right? They're China. They're the world's second largest economy. we understand what kind of disruption they could cause over the time. They don't need to demonstrate that. But they do feel that they need to catch up on innovation, less so than they had to before. They've got an agenda right now of what they want to accomplish by 2025 in artificial intelligence, in quantum computing, in autonomous vehicles. The list is, it's everybody else's list as well. And so they have tailored their cyber activity to go fulfill that goal. And not just their cyber activity, right? What Chinese nationals sent to universities around the world are looking for, not all of them, but some of them, and so forth. So that's the Chinese long game internationally. What we got wrong was how the Chinese would make use of the internet at home. I was White House correspondent for the Times in the late 90s during the end of Bill Clinton's presidency. And I'd go with him to China, and he'd always show up at the University of Beijing, Beida, for one of those speeches to students at the end of a trip. And the theme of the speeches was usually, the internet will be the end of the Communist Party. That once the Communist Party can't dominate the conversation, the political conversation in China, it will undercut its authority. And it will bring all kinds of information into China that right now ordinary Chinese can't use. And for a few years, it looked like he was going to win that bet. And then the Chinese got very good at walling off the Western internet. That's what the Great Wall, the Great Cyber Wall of China is all about, Great Firewall. They got extremely good at using techniques like facial recognition and artificial intelligence techniques around it to keep track of the population. They're now doing that with the social scores that are being issued to every Chinese about basically their loyalty to the government. And we got it completely wrong. It turned out the internet was a great source for the government to extend its ability to repress dissent rather than just a great source for dissenters to make their way. And we have to now readjust our own thinking about our China strategy for the recognition of the fact that this invention that was meant to open up the world has actually become the authoritarian's friend.
I'm just going to do two final questions with Iran and North Korea. On Iran, you famously broke the story of Olympic Games, described as one of the most, potentially the most sophisticated cyber attack that we've seen so far. Mike Hayden, the former head of the NSA and CIA, I think described it as somebody crossing the Rubicon with that attack, having the whiff of 1945 about it. Could you tell us a little bit, could you capture a bit of that thriller type juice that you got in the Perfect Weapon about how you broke that story and a bit of the behind the scenes research you did to get to that, and whether that's actually, you agree with Hayden's sort of characterization of it?
No, so I think Hayden was exactly right. It was a crossing of the Rubicon, and that statement that he made got him swept into the same FBI leak investigation that I went and dealt with after Olympic Games for about 4 years. They're really pleasant if you haven't been through that experience before. And there's more of this story of how we reported it in 0 Days, which is, you can download. It's an Alex Gibney documentary. He did a really great job that describes the whole Olympic Games process, and then, starting with the cyber researchers who figured out the code, and then moving on to me as I sort of dug into the decision-making in two governments, Israel and the United States, and two presidencies, President Bush and President Obama, to make the decision to go launch this attack, despite their reservations that when it became public that they had done it, it would inspire every other country that wants to go do cyber attacks against us to proceed with those. We started with the code, right? So the story here, for those of you who forgot it, is that in the summer of 2010, this code starts appearing all around the world and is replicating itself. Hundreds of thousands of copies of this. It's what became known as Stuxnet. And we looked at it, and the first thing that researchers noticed in it was there were stylistic differences in the code that made you think part of it was written by Americans and part of it was written by Israelis. That's because code, like anything else that you would read, has got stylistic tics in it. I mean, if you ask a journalist to read a Wall Street Journal story or a New York Times story, they're going to pick out which is which just by formatting issues of how you use Mr. and Ms. and Mrs. and sentence structure and so forth. You can do the same in coding, right? The second thing that became notable was examining the target. And I went to Germany and spent some time with an engineer who knew a lot about the code that was used to attack SCADA systems. These are the control systems that run chemical plants, water supply plants, any kind of factory process. It's a particularly specialized kind of computer system, and that's what was going on with Olympic Games because the Iranians were controlling their centrifuges with a system that was designed by Siemens, the German manufacturer. And periodically, before they figured out what was going on, they would call Siemens and say, can you fly your repairman over? We've got a little bit of a problem. And he would usually show up with a couple of USB keys that conveniently had some code on it to go sort out the problem. It had some other code on it as well, as it turned out, right? When we examined the coding, I remember sitting down with this engineer in Germany late one afternoon. It was right after Christmas. And he said to me, you know, David, it's the funniest thing. This code gets activated when it comes in contact with groups of 164 machines. It's the weirdest thing. And that was our eureka moment, because I had covered the Iranian nuclear program for years, and I knew that they organized their centrifuges in the Natanz nuclear enrichment plant in groups of 164. And once we had that element out of the code, and you were able to combine it with just a little bit of knowledge about how the Iranians enriched their uranium, which of course is the fuel for either nuclear power plants or if you keep enriching nuclear weapons, then you understood what the purpose of the code was. And then it was just a question of getting back to Washington and putting together the story of how two presidents organized this. It was a huge effort. I mean, it was highly classified, but there were hundreds of people who were involved in it, which is usually when a reporter can make some gains.
Well, let me ask you one final one. You mentioned you're heading off right after this event to Vietnam to attend the second summit with President Trump and the North Korean dictator.
See, I thought I was going to just be spending the week walking on Bondi Beach and, coming out to Canberra and talking to all your colleagues. And here I am going to Hanoi, you know, all expenses paid, yeah. Right.
Well, your reporting there also uncovered an interesting program that seemed to have quite a dramatic impact on the North Korean missile program.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit
Sure.
about that program?
So this was a cyber program designed against North Korea's missile tests. And what led us to the reporting was the fact that a few years ago, when North Korea was testing its missiles, you may recall that every time you picked up the paper, you discovered that they had dropped another one of these missiles after a few seconds after launch right into the water. And we knew that they were using a very well-tested, old, Soviet-designed 1960s rocket engine, missile engine that was so well-tested that it had about a 5% failure rate, if that, around the world as the Russians sold this thing. But in North Korea, the failure rate was 88%. And the North Koreans had been pretty good at launching missiles in the past. And we're thinking, these numbers do not make sense. And I'm with my colleague Bill Broad, who's a science reporter at the Times. I remember we were sitting around, we're looking at these, and we're saying, something else is going on here. Nobody runs an 88% failure rate when the global average is 5%. And again, we dug in, except this time we discovered that a lot of the evidence was out in the open, unclassified world, because companies that were seeking money for a program called left of launch, which is to say attacks on missiles before they're launched, not efforts to intercept them after they're launched, there was testimony all through Congress about this. They tried, by and large, to keep the name North Korea out of it, but we went on the websites of some of the big defense contractors and we discovered presentations they would make at conferences like this about left of launch, and there'd be a big picture of Kim Jong-un and a picture of a missile coming up out of the Korean Peninsula. It was subtle, but we got the point. So the first thing you do in that moment is you download the entire presentation before you call them, because you know that 3 minutes after the phone call is over, that presentation's coming off their website, right? So from that, we began to draw a picture of what the companies were doing, and again, we then found the participants in it. Now, what was interesting about this is it wasn't all cyber. Some of it was electronic warfare, and in the case of Iran, which has also had a high missile failure rate, particularly with these space launches they've been doing, it turned out not to be cyber as much as slipping in bad parts.
Right. Well, let's open it up for questions. If people would be able to just state their name and where they're coming from. Yeah, we've got a question right here. We'll just wait for the mic, which is coming down.
She's right here on the other side, right there.
Thank you. Hi, my name's May Regan. I'm not from anywhere. I'm just an interested person.
We're glad you came.
Thank you. Given how easy you have presented cyber manipulation like the Sony event, I'm amazed that we don't hear more or have more cyber attacks in the West. I mean, there must be many people who would want to attack countries like Australia, like Muslim terrorists or, you know, people like that. So why don't we have more?
You do, you just don't hear about many of them. There's a huge effort among companies when they are cyber attacked to hide it.
Right.
First, it's embarrassing. Okay, I mean, after all this stuff that's out there, if you haven't invested enough in your cyber capability, your cyber defenses, that's a problem. Second, if it's big enough, you're going to see your stock take a big hit if you're publicly listed, right? Mm-hmm. And in fact, some cyber events that companies never reported, we've only learned about in the United States because the Securities and Exchange Commission, not any kind of cyber group, but the Securities and Exchange Commission has come and fined the companies for not revealing a major event that could affect their earnings. Mm. Okay? So I was signing copies of the book yesterday at a bookstore north of Sydney, and somebody came up to me after the end and said, this was really interesting. My company just had to pay out basically $5 million for some very basic cyber mistakes we made, 5 million Australian dollars. It wasn't that big a company. And I said, did you ever announce this publicly? And he said, no, we never even thought about announcing it publicly. Mm. There are some people who believe in the United States, and I'm leaning toward this, that when a cyber attack gets above a certain threshold, you should be legally required to reveal it.
But what about public things like water that we drink? I mean, that's not a private company that could hide.
That's right. That's right. And we have not seen so far cyber attacks that, for example, affected the quality of your water. Mm. There was a big case in the United States involving a Chinese attack on a gas pipeline system, where we still haven't figured out if the Chinese were trying to figure out how to turn off the valves of the gas pipeline, or they were just trying to steal the technology so they could build their own pipelines.
We have another question right here. And then we've got a gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Stilgarian, allegedly a journalist. We keep hearing about China, Iran, Russia, DPRK. I'm always amused as an aside that we always try carefully to say China or Russia or Iran or whoever might be behind this, and then just keep saying China. But what about the next rank down? CrowdStrike's figures last week, for example, show that malicious activity out of Vietnam is really spiking now, and countries in that kind of rank.
So
Must be
when
coming up. What are your thoughts?
Sure. So when I started working on my previous book about 6 or 7 years ago called Confront and Conceal, which was the first one to tell the story of Olympic Games, the book was actually about Obama's broader foreign policy. We looked around for other countries that could do sophisticated cyber attacks. And there just hadn't been that many. There'd been denial of service attacks and so forth, but nothing anywhere near the sophistication of this. And this was just 2011, 2012. I started the same process with some researchers I had helping me on the perfect weapon. And they came back to me after about a week and said, we've hit 200 to 250 sophisticated attacks, 35 countries that can do it. Can we stop counting now? Because if we keep doing this, we're not going to have time to research anything else. So basically in that period of time of 6 or 7 years, we saw a huge explosion of this. And remember, it was Kennedy who in 1962 said he thought there would be 20 or 30 or 40 nuclear powers within a few years, and he was wrong, fortunately. But we have seen that explosion in cyber. And the reason is how cheap it is to do this. I mean, for nuclear, you need uranium, plutonium, millions of dollars of investment. For cyber, you need some teenagers, some 20-somethings, some stolen NSA code, which we've been discussing, some laptops, a case of Red Bull, and you're pretty much ready to go. So, you know, if it's 35 countries now, you can imagine how quickly that will expand.
Got a gentleman at the back.
Oh, hi, David. David Bather from Simpatico Communications. First of all, congratulations on Weapon of Choice and also your work on Deep State Radio. That's
Thank
awesome. My question is, most of the most successful attacks seem to be on softer targets. Do you think that we have focused a little bit too much on developed nations now in regards to electoral interference, but we should be refocusing again on, say, more developing nations, particularly more strategically important countries?
Absolutely. And, you know, I think you've seen this in the Huawei debate that has so captivated people here in Australia, because we've begun looking at Western, sort of the fringes of the Western alliance as they have tried to weigh the Huawei case. And, you know, it's very hard to turn Huawei down because it's not just the salesman who shows up. He shows up with somebody from the Chinese consulate who says, you know, we have very low interest loans that come along with this. And so suddenly a developing country is saying, we could spend $5 billion or $10 billion building the greatest system out of Nokia or Ericsson or American equipment or Canadian equipment. Or we could go with the Chinese and their interest-free loan. You know, so it's really those countries that are most vulnerable. One of our reporters was just in the Czech Republic. That's a really interesting case because they don't have a whole lot of money to build the 5G system. Huawei already builds their 4G system, including all the switching that runs through the presidential palace. And suddenly they're trying to decide, do we spend far more money that we could be spending on healthcare or new highways or something to build the 5G network just because the Americans and the Five Eyes want us to have a non-Chinese system? Or do we roll the dice, get the Chinese system, and have the money around for healthcare? And, you know, if you've got an election coming up in a couple of weeks, that changes that decision, right?
We had a gentleman right here at the front, if that's okay. So, just down here. Just.
Hello, John Magnussen from Macquarie University. Fantastic, suitably scary and inspiring to listen to you talk about this. We've taken the step down from nuclear weapons, where the cost of deployment, both sides is high, to what I went through 5 to 10 years ago, the CBRNE, which is still scaring people with stuff like Novichok, to the cyber side of things where we are right now, where even problems like stock control can kill, where if you say it's over there, but it's not when you really need it, it's in the wrong place. It seems that what we've got more than anything else is an incredible proliferation of soft and attainable targets. So my question really is, how do we prioritize what has to be finite resources to try and protect an incredible proliferation of targets which would hurt so many people?
So in the United States, 85 to 90% of the big targets are in the private sector, and that makes this difficult because the US government cannot mandate that every company spend huge amounts of money on cyber protection, right? And as you suggest in your question, some things are a lot more important to protect than others, right? We want our autonomous cars protected pretty well, because when you get into one and tell it you want to go to the supermarket, you know, you really don't want to head off of those lovely cliffs just outside of Sydney, right? But other things you might view as less vital. And at times, that's led us to make some misjudgments. So, for example, movie studios are not critical national infrastructure. We all like going to the movies, but if we had to live with it for a few weeks, most of us could probably make it through. Some of you in the room probably couldn't. But the Sony attack turned out to lead to a big debate inside the US government. Is this an act of war? Is this an act of sabotage? Is it just an act of vandalism, which is what President Obama at one point called it, and then regretted that? Election systems were not on our critical infrastructure list in the United States. Monuments were, because of their symbolic value. So the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial in Washington were on the list, but the mechanisms that make up the infrastructure of our democracy, the ability to make sure that you've conducted a fair and transparent election and can check the results, was not on the list. And it was an interesting moment when the Obama administration tried to put it on the list. And you'll know that in the US, as in Australia, there's a federal system, so the states run the elections even though they mass together into a federal election. And there were some governors who were on the phone saying, not having any federal government take over of my systems, which really got in the way. So this is not going to be an easy thing to go do. It's not as if somebody can just mandate what's going to be a protection. And sometimes the best protection is simply not to have something connected to a computer network. You know, the big lesson out of the elections is you shouldn't be using an election box, a machine, a voting machine, that does not have paper backup to it.
Interestingly, the Australian electoral processes are not listed as critical national infrastructure. Very interesting to see whether the attack
That might be a good start, yeah.
Questions? We've got 5 minutes left. Jamie.
Thank you. Jamie Tarabay from the New York Times. We've spent so much time talking about nefarious cyber actors, but I'd like it if you could just talk a little bit about the sort of the state versus tech companies, particularly with the NSA and the pushback from tech companies like Google. And, you know, in Australia recently we had this encryption law that passed that the tech companies, the US-based tech companies, were upset about. And then the sort of the tension between how do you deal with privacy and then, you know, having access and then having the government trying to infiltrate it for their own purposes as well. Sure. Thank you.
So Jamie's touched on a couple of real hot spot issues in the United States. So in the Cold War, we had a group of companies for whom the United States government was basically the main customer. So there was no question that Raytheon was going to build radar systems for the United States government for military purposes, or that Boeing and McDonnell Douglas were going to go out and build military aircraft. And in part, that's because the companies identified themselves as American, and in part because their main revenue source was the government. Now switch to Google in the cyber age. the US government is a tiny fraction, and other Western governments, of Google's revenues, right? Same thing for Apple. And number two, the engineers who are working there are a pretty libertarian bent. So in the Google case last year, you saw an uprising on the Google campus against against the participation in a project that would basically involve Google technology to help drones discriminate between targets. Now, the Pentagon's argument for helping the discrimination against targets was a pretty good one. They said, we're trying to reduce civilian casualties. And so we want to have software that makes it clear that that farmer who's standing out in the field with a rake in his hand is not a soldier standing out in the field with an AK-47 in his hand, or a terrorist. They thought that was a pretty good cause. They're trying to reduce civilian casualties. The Google engineers looked at this and said, we're helping the Pentagon improve their targeting on a drone system. Forget it. And they actually pressured the company's leadership into withdrawing from this program called Project Maven. Microsoft has taken a different view. It's selling to the US government, but it says it will call the US government out if they believe they're using the technology in the wrong way. Amazon, in contrast, has said nothing other than, as long as you've got Prime, we'll ship it to you for free. Okay? And so Amazon runs the cloud service for the CIA and is bidding for a $10 billion US program to run the cloud service for the Pentagon, and probably would have won it by now, save for the fact that the founder of Amazon also owns the Washington Post, and it turns out that that's not President Trump's favorite newspaper. After the failing New York Times, it sort of falls right into the category on his tweets. So he calls it the Amazon Washington Post. So there's some question about whether Amazon will get that. But this tension is quite real, and people in the Pentagon are worried about it because they don't have the innovative skills to go develop what you need to develop at the speed at which you need to develop it. And this problem's only going to get worse. Now, one last point, and it goes on the Australian law that was passed that would essentially require anybody building an iPhone, any other device they're selling in Australia, to be able to have a back door that they could get in with legal process. I can understand why investigators want to go do this, but the fact of the matter is, if you build a back door that the manufacturer has so that government investigators can get in, it's only a matter of time before the Chinese, the Russians, anybody else we've been talking about here today, figure out how to use that back door to get in themselves. As somebody who used to work in security, run the security operations at Facebook, put it to me, it's like drilling a hole in your windshield. You know, you're weakening the entire structure, and you're not going to drive around with that. And there's a big split even within the US government about the wisdom of doing that.
I think we have time for one more, no more quick questions.
A quick
one more, being told. I think there was a gentleman at the back right there, yeah.
Hi, my name's Cam. I'm from the ANU in Canberra. So a big question, especially for Australia, is how cyber attacks, especially on our own political parties, could influence the Five Eyes relationship. Could this lead to a deteriorating trust between nations, especially those with different relationships towards China?
Well, you're already seeing a bit of the tension in the Huawei case. I mean, Huawei's been the great Rorschach test, right? They're all sharing the intelligence about what the danger is from Huawei. The case against Huawei is largely a circumstantial case so far, right? Nobody's found Huawei actually diverting data back to Beijing, but the fear is that in the 5G world, the fifth generation networks, that would be very easy to do because so much of the switch is a virtual switch. It's just a very thick layer of software that's constantly being updated. So the chance of putting this in could be big. Last week, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, who we've run a big profile of that you can see on the Times site today that I did with my colleague Ed Wong, and we spent a fair bit of time on how he's handling the tensions here. Pompeo stepped out and said, if you build a system through Huawei, we're not going to be able to share intelligence with you. He used to be the CIA director, so presumably he knows from whence he speaks. This is not just that he's speaking as Secretary of State. And that raised a really interesting question to us. Are you saying that if the British decide to let Huawei into part or all of their network, that the closest intelligence relationship we have between the US and Britain is going to go away? It's not as much an issue, obviously, for Australia, since you've made the decision already to bar Huawei, but it may be for Canada, and it may be for New Zealand, which has made sort of partial decisions. So yeah, I think this is going to be a continuing area of tension if the Five Eyes believe that some members are protecting their data less well than others.
David, thank you so much. I can see a lot of questions still out there, which is always the best way to finish these discussions. It's been a real treat to have you out here. We just covered such a terrific breadth of continents and issues. I'm just sorry you won't be able to experience the two tourism highlights of Australia, Bondi and Canberra. But there's always next time.
You know, you can see Bondi from the windows of the New York Times Bureau. And I said to some of our folks who are working there today, doesn't this drive you crazy watching everybody out having a good time on the beach while we're all stuck behind our laptops? You know? But I promise, on my next trip, I will come back to Canberra because I remember what a rocking night scene there is.
There is. You heard it from the New York Times. I wanted to thank our New York Times colleagues, partners. They're such wonderful friends of our centre. And just finally, if you could all join me in thanking David. It's been a terrific discussion.